Okay, well, thank you for letting me take part in this really interesting workshop and present some of the work I've been doing together with Tapio Mappes, Lauri Saxwehr, and Stephen Heap on collective action problems in group-structured populations. So collective action problems, they revolve around the problem, how can you sustain cooperation if the benefits of cooperation are shared but the costs are private? And of course we know that there's multiple of different solutions like relatedness or reciprocity or reputation. But what we have been looking at is the effect of group interactions and group competition in maintaining cooperation. And more lately we have been also looking at the emergence of group competition and the dynamics of group formation, sort of building into this. So in all the studies I'll be talking about today, we have had human subjects interacting anonymously via computers in social dilemma situations. And it's obvious that such experiments do not incorporate all factors that are important in real-life interactions like reciprocity, reputation, or threat of physical violence. However, the inference that can be made from the experiments we have done are quite limited. But by simplifying the system to some key social interactions, I think that we can look at some processes more clearly than in more complex situations. So most of our experiments are constructed around the public goods game, and to illustrate the general logic of the game that you probably know already. And our first study on the effects of between group competition or within group cooperation. I'll show how the study works, or the game works. So the subjects play the game in groups of 4, and each subject is given a certain amount of money that they can either keep to themselves or allocate to a group project, which is then doubled and shared equally among the players. And because the return for each dollar to a person allocating the group project is only 50 cents, it makes sense only to keep all the money to yourself, but that then destroys the efficiency of a group, because everybody would be best off if everybody would cooperate fully. And what is known that in these sort of games, especially if the groups are changing every round, you have the declining cooperation. So what we did was to add between group competition to this sort of game. And the between group competition, there was no external prize, but the groups were matched, and the group with a more money would earn twice the difference in the group earnings, and the money would be transferred from the losing group to the winning group and shared equally, and the losers would share the losses equally. So the game was played so that the subjects first played 10 rounds of the basic public goods game, and then 10 rounds of the game with the group competition. And sure enough, we see the decline in cooperation, and then when we have group competition, there is a high level and stable level of cooperation. And just to check for whether there was some treatment order effects, we did them in opposite order. So first group competition and then no group competition, and qualitatively the same result. And here, because the amount of money earned was just a linear function of how much they invested, just by installing group competition you had really high increase in the efficiency and earning of the participants. So we saw that embedding the public goods game in between group competition context transformed the payoff structure so that the incentive to free ride was not there anymore, and that allowed for high levels of cooperation and higher overall earnings. But of course in this game there was no costs of group competition, so that's something to keep in mind. Now we have been talking you have been talking about the role of punishment in maintaining cooperation, and we did another study on punishment, and especially punishment and group competition. So we know that people are really willing to punish others, and that often leads to increase in cooperation. But as punishing somebody carries cost to the punisher, and the benefits of increased cooperation are shared, so punishment is a second-order social dilemma which requires an explanation of its own. And punishment by itself is highly counterproductive. So punishing somebody carries cost, and being punished carries cost, and often what is not reported, but when you study, look at the results very closely in many published studies, often the costs of punishment actually completely overwhelm the benefits of cooperation, so there's no efficiency gain from punishment. So what we did was compare the success of individuals in groups that had punishment technology and groups that did not have punishment technology, and looked at how this interacts with group competition. And sure enough, we found that punishment increased cooperation. There's nothing exciting there. But what was interesting was that between group competition enormously increased the benefits of punishment. So here on the y-axis you see the net earnings, average net earnings per game round, and on the top panel there is no competition between groups, so the groups are isolated. And you see that, okay, when there is punishment, there is a marginally bigger net earnings in that sort of group than in the groups without punishment. But when you have the groups competing, so that one group is able to punish and the other not, and okay, I must say that these groups were groups of 8, and they were stable groups, so it's a bit different design technically, and I can give you all the technical details later, or you can find them in the paper. So when you have groups competing, the punishment groups completely dominated the no punishing groups. So if there's group competition, punishment is beneficial even with its costs, and punishment could easily evolve in presence of between group competition. And when we were analyzing the data, we also found an interesting result that in groups with punishment, the individual differences earnings were very small compared to groups without punishment. So here you again have net earnings, and the white box plots are groups without punishment institution, and the gray ones are with punishment institution. So here you don't have competition. You see that with punishment there is everybody earns the same in the group. There's difference between groups, but not within the groups. Whereas you have plenty of variance within groups when there's no punishment, and the same thing happens here. So what this means evolutionarily is that there's, for an individual to increase her fitness or earnings, there's nothing you can pretty much do, I mean, at least in this game, except increase the fitness of your group. So just by having punishing technology, you can that creates a situation where any behavior that is group beneficial can pretty much evolve. So you have very strong group selection sort of going on. So punishment technology impacts group competition in a way that makes evolution of group beneficial traits easy. And we also found that so in addition to the treatments that I showed you, we also had a treatment where there were two groups that were competing. They were both having punishment institution. And so that's the black dots. And here is what you saw earlier, so the punishment versus no punishment. So when you have two groups punishing, their level of cooperation is very close, and the group competition is very tight. And that, if we look at the data, we see that free riders are much more harshly punished in this sort of situation, and also the received punishment, how much the groups allocate to punishment altogether is substantially larger when the group competition is very intense. So we see that, okay, group competition intensifies the use of punishment. And in these two studies I've talked about, we have imposed group competition on the subjects. But of course, the question of this workshop and what is an interesting question is, where does group competition come from? How does it arise? And as a first attempt to tackle this issue of endogenous group competition, we performed experiments where the subjects could choose the type of interaction they would like their group to have with other groups. So if your Finnish is not up to the standard yet, so it says choose the interaction type and investment to your group project. So they could vote for their group to remain separate from other groups, to share their winnings equally with other group, or compete with the other group. And at the same time, they also decide how much do they want to contribute. And there was also, we set the rules so that if group competition took place, everybody lost one money unit, so that would make competition socially inefficient. And as a control treatment, it was just a basic public goods game with that you could only decide how much they contribute. The groups would be compared, but there would be no money exchange. So what we see that in the beginning of the game, competition was not chosen more often than the other interaction types, but over the course of the game, competition clearly became the most prominent strategy. And so in the end, or during most of the game, competition was the most prevalent thing that was happening. And one motivation the subjects reported for why they vote for competition was that it was going to happen anyway. And it doesn't really make sense, but it suggests that there is something that anticipating group competition increased the likelihood of it really taking place. So it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there was also very nuanced determinants that could be sort of why people, when would people vote for competition, and this could, when you look at the data very closely. So motivated by price equations, sort of the variances between and within groups, we analyzed what were the determinants for voting for competition. So we see that when there was, and this was sort of, people observed they see something, what was happening in the previous round, so there's a lot of variance in my group, little variance between groups, and they knew that the groups were going to be shuffled and reformed, so what was going to happen next round doesn't really, we don't know what's going to happen next round because everything's going to be played differently again. But still, if they saw that there was a lot of variation within their own group, that decreased the likelihood or probability that they would vote for competition. And if they saw that the groups were very different in performance, they would increase the likelihood of voting for competition. And this is for first round, and this is for last round, and then all the other rounds would be there. So this is model prediction. And then we also looked at what were the decisions to cooperate for different group interaction votes. So if an individual voted for competition, they also cooperated at a high rate and stable rate, but if they voted for separate or sharing, then the levels of cooperation were really low and diminishing. So if you again look at the net earnings, you see that when group interactions were allowed, even with the costs that were involved with group competition, you had the net earnings being higher than groups when groups were separated due to the high frequency of voting for competition and the high cooperation that was associated with it. So in these games we see that aggression led to emergence of group competition, and there was a correlation between voting for competition and cooperation. And there was some evidence of feedback, sort of group competition, sort of feeding back into more group competition, sort of leading possibly explaining this sort of steady increase in competition. Okay, so so far we had subjects were forced to interact in some size of a group, but in reality this is not the case. I mean, people can decide whether or not to join a group and what sort of group they join to. And to relax this assumption, our latest experiment allowed for individuals to also decide on the size of the group they want to form, in addition to their level of cooperation and the type of interaction in the group. And as a control, again, we had a game where only group size and cooperation were allowed to choose, and groups were kept always separate. And in this experimental treatment, which should have been done already in the first experiment with this, was that now just clicking the competition button cost you individually. So this is a personal cost just for voting for competition, and it was 2 money units out of 20, so it's not trivial. Okay, and important thing is that we also had, we again had the group project was multiplied by 2, so meaning the larger the group is, the less incentive it makes for yourself to contribute. So, and the smaller, if you go into a groups of size of 1 or 2, then you should actually cooperate fully, and so there's no social dilemma there. So here we have the mean group size preference data. So when groups were separated, I mean, here the benchmark would be that you just form groups of size of 1 or 2. Surprisingly, I wasn't expecting it. People were actually voting for reasonably high-sized groups. Okay, then they learned the game, and they went into very small groups, because that's really the only thing that makes sense. But when you have group interactions decided by the subjects, you have an initial increase in the group size, and there's some complex dynamics going on that we haven't analyzed yet, but you have a decline in group size, but still the groups are bigger than, I mean, they include several individuals. If you look at how much do they cooperate according to their group size preference, so we see that, okay, larger groups, less cooperation, which makes sense economically. But in these intermediate-sized groups, there's a difference between the treatments. So when the interactions were decided by the subjects, you had actually sort of substantially higher cooperation there. And if you look at the votes for different types, you see that there's a lot of, about a third of votes are for competition, regardless of group size preference, it's quite a lot considering that this was individually costly. And only if you vote to be in group size 1, then you clearly avoid the competitive choice, which makes sense, of course, because small groups or very small group is like to lose in competition. So the possibility to enter group competition did sort of lead to formation of larger groups than when it was not possible. But this did not lead to higher efficiency, because when groups were formed, they entered in social dilemma, which caused them to free ride, and the efficiency was higher when there was no group interactions allowed, since then they could safely go into small groups or groups of 1 and then just exploit this money-making machine that was available. So what do we learn from this? people are very sensitive to changes in the game structure and show great plasticity in behavior. So we see people changing strategy from round to round all the time. And endogenous decisions can drastically change the game structure with the knock-on effects on social structure and levels of cooperation. And sort of what might be relevant for this workshop is that, at least I think, that models of human social behavior should allow for this sort of plasticity and feedback between behavioral decisions and social structure. So it might not, I mean, if we want to make predictive or descriptive models of real interactions, then classifying people as cooperators or defectors, it's not going to be very accurate. And then you also have to consider that maybe the social structure is an emergent property that is arising from decisions, so that it's going to get complicated, but interesting. Okay, with that, thank you.
Thanks for this talk. I have just a short question for clarification. In the last study, did you say that the multiplication factor was always 2?
Always.
That means the larger the group, the smaller the marginal per capita return. So it's a second order public good in that a rational self-interested player should not enter a group larger size 1 at all, right? Because every point I contribute if I'm playing alone is doubled.
Well, yeah, in group size 2 it doesn't really matter what you decide, but in group size 1 you should contribute, and that's true when the groups cannot interact, when they cannot compete. When they can compete, there's actually no ESS, and I should have said it. There is no solution that cannot be invaded by some other strategy. And if somebody's interested in talking how to analyze this, that would be fun.
So I had 2 questions. One is, your subjects, are they same gender, different genders, and if so, are there the gender effect?
No, that's something, okay. So we collect all sorts of, it's mostly Finnish students. One study was done in Germany, but we find no gender effects, very little any sort of background data explaining anything, but I think that is because the game is so abstract. There's no physical threat or anything, so we don't find anything.
And one more thing, did you get any anecdotes or the sort of feedback response from people who chose to share? So you said people who chose to compete did so because they thought it was inevitable. Did you get anything from the sharers?
Well, they tried to parasitize a group that was cooperating more and thought that this might be a earning strategy, which sometimes worked.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've run experiments yet looking at the interaction between punishment and choosing group competition or not choosing, what you called aggression.
No, we haven't done that.
If there's a punishment versus non-punishment condition imposed, or if you're allowed to choose or not choose punishment, how does that interact with choosing or not choosing group competition?
We haven't done that yet, no.
Study by Gurek. Have you seen that? Gurek is in Science, I think.
Yeah.
And he had that condition where you could choose to be in a group with punishment.
Institution, yeah.
Yeah. And that was a resounding result that people, after experiencing the declining cooperation, they then chose to be in a punishment group.
They see the point.
Which I think is what